The sickening thud of Solomon's body hitting the dirt road pierced Joseph's soul, the once mighty horse now a trembling heap of bones beneath the merciless sun. What began as a desperate rescue would soon reverse as the dying horse became the old man's only hope for survival. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dirt road stretched endlessly across the horizon, bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. The air was heavy with the scent of parched earth and summer heat. Old Joseph Morgan had been traveling since dawn, his worn wooden cart creaking rhythmically behind him, loaded with what little remained of his possessions. At 73, Joseph's weathered face told the story of a life lived under the open sky, each wrinkle a testament to years of hardship and rare moments of joy. His white beard, now yellowed slightly at the edges, framed a face that had seen the changing of seasons more times than he cared to count. The journey had been long and unforgiving. Joseph was heading to his daughter's home after losing his farm to the bank, a place he had poured his soul into for over 4 decades. The drought had been merciless for 3 consecutive years, turning once fertile land into a wasteland of cracked earth and withered hopes. When the bank finally came for the last payment, Joseph had nothing left to give except his dignity, which he surrendered with quiet resignation. Beside him walked Solomon, his faithful draft horse, a once magnificent beast whose strength had carried Joseph through the toughest of times. Solomon, like Joseph, was now a shadow of his former self. The animal's ribs pressed visibly against his dull brown coat, and his steps had grown increasingly labored as the miles stretched behind them. Joseph noticed the horse's deteriorating condition but pushed forward, driven by the desperate need to reach his destination before his meager supplies ran out. "Just a little further, old friend," Joseph murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper carried away by the gentle breeze. "We'll rest properly when we reach Martha's place." Solomon's ears twitched at his master's voice, but the horse's gait continued to slow. Joseph knew the animal was suffering, but the stubborn pride that had sustained him through a lifetime of challenges prevented him from acknowledging the severity of Solomon's condition. They had to keep moving. There was no other choice. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the dusty road, Solomon's breathing became more labored. The horse's head hung lower with each step, and a fine tremor ran through his powerful legs. Joseph felt a tug on the reins as Solomon struggled to maintain the pace. "Come on now," Joseph urged, more firmly this time. "We've weathered worse than this, you and I." But nature has its limits, and Solomon had reached his. With a soft, almost apologetic whine, the horse's front legs buckled beneath him. Joseph watched in horror as his faithful companion collapsed onto the dirt road, sending a cloud of dust billowing around them. The horse lay on his side, his great chest heaving with each desperate breath, eyes wide with pain and exhaustion. "Solomon!" Joseph cried out, dropping the reins and rushing to the fallen animal's side. The proud farmer fell to his knees beside his horse, hands hovering helplessly over the trembling body. "No, no, no, not now, old friend. Not like this." Reality crashed down on Joseph with the weight of mountains. He had pushed too hard, asked too much of an animal that had already given everything. Guilt and shame washed over him as he realized his own desperation had blinded him to Solomon's suffering. "What have I done?" he whispered, gently stroking the horse's neck. "I'm sorry, old boy. I'm so sorry." Solomon's eyes, still bright despite his weakened state, locked onto Joseph's. There was no accusation in that gaze, only trust and the pain of a body that could go no further. Joseph felt tears forming, something he hadn't allowed himself in years, not even when they took his farm, not even when his wife of 40 years had been laid to rest beneath the old oak tree. With shaking hands, Joseph reached for his canteen. It was half empty. The water inside meant to sustain him until he reached the next well. Without hesitation, he uncapped it, and held it to Solomon's mouth, letting the precious liquid flow onto the horse's dry tongue. "Drink, Solomon. Please drink," he urged, his voice breaking. The horse lapped weakly at the water, and Joseph poured more, unconcerned about conserving it for himself. Solomon's needs came first now, a realization that had come too late. As the horse drank, Joseph assessed their situation. They were still miles from Martha's home, alone on a rarely traveled road, with the sun setting and his horse unable to continue. The weight of his predicament settled on his shoulders, like a physical burden. There was no passing traveler to help, no nearby farm to seek assistance from. It was just him, Solomon, and the encroaching darkness. Joseph settled more comfortably on the ground, cradling Solomon's head in his lap. "We'll rest here a while," he said softly, "just until you get your strength back." But deep down, Joseph knew that Solomon's collapse wasn't merely fatigue. The horse was malnourished, dehydrated, and pushed beyond endurance. Years of loyalty rewarded with neglect, not out of cruelty, but out of Joseph's own desperate circumstances. The realization cut deeper than any physical pain Joseph had ever endured. As twilight descended, Joseph remained by Solomon's side, occasionally offering water and gentle words of comfort. The distant chirping of crickets filled the silence between them, a natural chorus that had accompanied countless journeys in happier times. "Remember when we plowed the north field together?" Joseph reminisced, his calloused hand rhythmically stroking Solomon's mane. "You were so young and strong then. Martha was just a little girl riding on your back while I worked the land. Those were good days, weren't they?" Solomon's breathing had steadied somewhat, but the horse made no attempt to rise. Joseph didn't press him. Instead, he reached into his small pack and pulled out a wrinkled apple, the last piece of fruit he had, saved for a moment of desperate hunger. Without hesitation, he cut it into small pieces with his pocket knife and offered them to Solomon, who accepted the treat with gentle lips. "That's it," Joseph encouraged. "Small bites. We've got all night if that's what you need." As darkness fell completely, Joseph reluctantly left Solomon's side to unhitch the cart and set up a makeshift camp. He gathered what little dry grass he could find along the roadside and placed it near Solomon's mouth, then covered the horse with his only blanket. The night air was growing cool, and Joseph would suffer the chill, but Solomon's comfort mattered more. Under the vast canopy of stars, Joseph settled back beside his fallen companion, his weathered hand resting on Solomon's neck, feeling each breath, each heartbeat. They had traveled countless miles together, from the prime of their lives to this moment of shared vulnerability on a deserted road. "We'll figure this out come morning," Joseph promised, though uncertainty gnawed at his heart. "You and me, just like always." Dawn broke with tentative fingers of light stretching across the sky, painting the clouds in soft pinks and golds. Joseph awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the hard ground beneath him and the open sky above. Reality returned swiftly as he felt Solomon's warm body still beside him. The horse had survived the night but remained on the ground, his breathing shallow but steady. "Morning, old friend," Joseph said, his voice rough with sleep and worry. He placed a gentle hand on Solomon's neck, relieved to feel the steady pulse beneath his fingertips. "How are you feeling today?" Solomon's eyes, once bright with spirit, now gazed at Joseph with quiet resignation. The horse made a weak attempt to lift his head but couldn't sustain the effort. Joseph's heart sank. Whatever strength Solomon had regained overnight wasn't enough to get him back on his feet. Joseph rose stiffly, his aged joints protesting after a night spent on the hard ground. He stretched, wincing at the pain in his lower back, then retrieved his canteen. The water level was dangerously low now, but he didn't hesitate to offer it to Solomon first. The horse drank weakly, each swallow seeming to require great effort. "We need more water," Joseph muttered, scanning the horizon. The landscape was unforgiving, dry fields stretching in all directions, the road cutting through like a pale ribbon. But Joseph's experienced eyes caught sight of a cluster of trees in the distance, perhaps a mile away. Where there were trees of that size, there might be water. "I need to find us some water, Solomon," he explained, crouching down to meet the horse's gaze. "I won't be gone long. You rest here." Joseph hesitated before leaving. Abandoning Solomon, even temporarily, felt like a betrayal, but staying would do neither of them any good. With a heavy heart, he gathered his canteen and a small pail from the cart. "I'll be back before the sun is high," he promised, giving Solomon one last pat. "You hang on." The walk to the trees was arduous. Joseph's legs, already weary from days of travel, protested with each step. The sun, though still low in the sky, beat down relentlessly. By the time he reached the small grove, sweat soaked his shirt, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. To his immense relief, Joseph's instincts had been correct. A small spring bubbled up from beneath the rocks, creating a modest pool before disappearing back into the earth. The water was clear and cool, a precious resource in this parched landscape. Joseph drank deeply, feeling life flow back into his tired body. Then he filled his canteen in the pail, taking care not to spill a drop on his return journey. The walk back seemed even longer, the pail growing heavier with each step. Joseph's arms trembled with the effort, but he refused to stop or spill the precious liquid. Thoughts of Solomon, lying helpless on the road, spurred him forward, despite the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. When he finally reached Solomon, the horse had not moved. Joseph set down his burdens and knelt beside his faithful companion, offering the canteen first. Solomon drank more eagerly this time, the fresh water seeming to revive him somewhat. Encouraged, Joseph retrieved a rag from his pack, soaked it in the pail, and began to gently wipe down Solomon's body, paying special attention to his neck and legs where the heat and fatigue would be most intensely felt. "That's better, isn't it?" Joseph murmured as he worked. "Nothing like cool water to bring back some life." As Joseph tended to Solomon, his mind raced with possibilities, none of them promising. He couldn't leave Solomon behind. The very thought was unthinkable, but he couldn't stay here indefinitely either. Their supplies were limited, and Joseph himself wasn't getting any younger. The exertion of the morning had highlighted his own frailty, a fact he usually chose to ignore. Hours passed, and Joseph continued his ministrations, offering water, providing shade with a makeshift canopy fashioned from his coat and a branch, and speaking words of encouragement. By midday, Solomon had begun to show small signs of improvement, his eyes more alert, his breathing less labored. But still, he made no attempt to rise. "You need food, that's what you need," Joseph decided, looking around desperately. The roadside grasses were sparse and dry, hardly enough to sustain a rabbit, let alone a horse of Solomon's size. But in the distance, near the spring he'd visited earlier, Joseph had noticed patches of greener grass. Once again, he would have to leave Solomon to help him. "I'll be back with something for you to eat," Joseph promised. "Just keep fighting, old boy." The second journey was even harder than the first. The midday sun showed no mercy, and Joseph's earlier exertion had depleted his already limited reserves. But determination drove him forward, one painful step after another. At the spring, he found what he was looking for, patches of relatively lush grass nourished by the nearby water. Joseph harvested as much as he could carry, filling his shirt after removing it despite the sun's harsh rays on his bare skin. The return journey was a blur of pain and determination. Joseph's vision swam, and several times he had to stop to prevent himself from collapsing. But the thought of Solomon, alone and hungry, drove him onward. When he finally reached the horse, Joseph's legs gave out and he fell to his knees beside his friend. "Gotcha. Some food," he gasped, spreading the grass before Solomon. The horse sniffed at the offering, then began to eat slowly, methodically. Joseph felt a surge of triumph at this small victory. He crawled to the pail, drank deeply, then collapsed beside Solomon, utterly spent. As the afternoon wore on, Joseph drifted in and out of consciousness, the exhaustion of his efforts and the relentless heat taking their toll. Each time he awoke, he checked on Solomon, offered water, and spoke words of encouragement. The horse continued to eat the grass in small amounts, and Joseph made 2 more grueling trips to gather more, each journey more difficult than the last. By late afternoon, Joseph's situation had become as precarious as Solomon's. His skin burned from sun exposure, his lips were cracked despite his efforts to stay hydrated, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest at the slightest movement. Yet he continued to care for Solomon, prioritizing the horse's needs above his own. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, marking the end of their first full day stranded on the road, Joseph sat beside Solomon, one hand resting on the horse's neck. "We've made it through today," he said softly. "That's something, isn't it? One day at a time, that's all we can do." Solomon turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Joseph's. In that gaze, Joseph saw a glimmer of the spirit that had always defined his faithful companion, a resilience that matched his own. It wasn't much, but it was enough to kindle a spark of hope in Joseph's weary heart. "Tomorrow will be better," Joseph promised, though he had no reason to believe it would be. "Tomorrow, maybe you'll stand again. And if not tomorrow, then the day after. We're not giving up, you and I. Not after all we've been through." As twilight descended, Joseph made one last trip to the spring, returning with water for the night. He settled beside Solomon, sharing the blanket he'd placed over the horse, seeking warmth as the desert air quickly cooled. Above them, stars began to appear, countless points of light in the vast darkness. "We're not alone out here," Joseph whispered, gazing upward. "Someone will come along. Someone will help us." But as sleep claimed him, Joseph knew he was lying to himself. This road was seldom traveled, especially in these hard times. If help was to come, it would have to be by chance or miracle. And Joseph had long ago stopped believing in either. Joseph's dreams were fragmented and feverish, filled with images of parched fields and dying crops. In them he wandered endlessly, searching for water that evaporated as soon as he reached it. He awoke with a gasp just before dawn, his throat dry and his body aching more intensely than before. For a moment he thought he was back on his farm, waking from a nightmare. Then he felt Solomon's warmth beside him and remembered their dire situation. "Another day, old friend," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Joseph struggled to sit up, every joint protesting the movement. The exertions of the previous day had taken a severe toll. His hands, already gnarled from decades of farm work, were now blistered and raw from carrying the heavy pail. His exposed skin had turned an angry red, the beginnings of a severe sunburn that would only worsen as the day progressed. Solomon lay much as he had the day before, but Joseph noticed something different in the horse's eyes, a clearer gaze, more alert than yesterday. The food and water had helped, but not enough to get the animal back on his feet. "How are you feeling today?" Joseph asked, running his hand along Solomon's neck. The horse responded with a soft whicker, a sound that lifted Joseph's spirits despite everything. It was the first vocal response he'd heard from Solomon since the collapse. Joseph's first priority was water. The pail was nearly empty after their night, and both he and Solomon would need more to survive another day under the relentless sun. With great effort, he pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over him. "I'll get us some water," he said, picking up the canteen and pail. You rest easy." The journey to the spring seemed even longer this morning. Joseph's steps were unsteady, and twice he had to stop and sit when his vision blurred and the landscape tilted alarmingly. But somehow, he made it, collapsing beside the small pool of water with a groan of relief. As he filled the containers, Joseph heard a sound that made him freeze, the distant rumble of wheels on the dirt road. Someone was coming. His heart raced with sudden hope, and he scrambled to his feet, forgetting his exhaustion. "Help!" he called, his voice cracking. "Help us!" But the spring was too far from the road, his voice too weak to carry the distance. Joseph grabbed the water containers and began to hurry back, his pace agonizingly slow despite his desperation. By the time he reached the road, he knew he was too late. In the distance, he could just make out the receding form of a wagon, already too far to hail. "No," he whispered, despair washing over him. Their first chance at rescue, gone in moments because he wasn't there when it passed. If only he'd stayed with Solomon. If only the traveler had seen the horse and stopped. Joseph sank to his knees beside Solomon, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. "Someone came by," he explained, his voice hollow. "But they didn't see us. They're gone now." Solomon regarded him with those deep, understanding eyes, and Joseph felt a sudden surge of determination replace his despair. They had missed this chance, but there might be others. He needed to be ready. Most importantly, he needed to make sure the next traveler would see them and stop. "We need to be more visible," Joseph declared, looking around with new purpose. Their current position, while directly on the road, was in a slight dip between two gentle rises. A traveler wouldn't see them until quite close, and by then might be moving too fast to notice a man and a horse in distress. Joseph's gaze settled on his cart. It wasn't much, but if positioned properly, it might catch the eye of a passing traveler. With renewed energy born of desperation, Joseph began to unhitch the cart completely from its harness. The task was monumental for a man in his condition, but determination drove him forward, one painful movement at a time. It took nearly an hour, but Joseph finally managed to maneuver the cart to the top of the nearest rise, positioning it half on and half off the road, an unmistakable sign that something was amiss. Exhausted but satisfied, he made his way back to Solomon. "That should do it," he said, offering water to the horse before taking some himself. "Next person who comes along will have to stop now." The rest of the morning passed slowly. Joseph made another trip for grass. Though the journey left him so weakened, he feared he might not make it back to Solomon. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying until the air seemed to shimmer above the road. Joseph created another makeshift shade for Solomon, using branches he'd gathered and his coat, though it left him exposed to the sun's punishment. By midday, Joseph's condition had deteriorated significantly. His sunburn had worsened, his skin now blistering in places. Dehydration set in despite his efforts to ration the water, bringing with it a pounding headache and increasing confusion. Still, he continued to care for Solomon, offering water and gentle encouragement. "Martha will be wondering where we are by now," Joseph said, his thoughts drifting to his daughter. "She might send someone to look for us. She's always been a thoughtful girl." Solomon shifted slightly, and Joseph noticed with a start that the horse was making more deliberate movements than before. His front legs stretched out, then contracted, as if testing their strength. Hope flickered in Joseph's chest. "That's it, Solomon," he encouraged. "You're getting stronger. Maybe tomorrow you can try to stand." As the afternoon wore on, Joseph's periods of lucidity grew shorter. The combination of heat, exhaustion, and dehydration was taking its toll. He found himself talking to Ruth, his long-dead wife, as if she were sitting beside him. He told her about the farm they'd lost, about Solomon's collapse, about his fear that he might die here, on this forgotten road. "I did my best, Ruth," he murmured, staring at a point in the distance. "I always tried to do right by everyone. But I failed. I failed the farm. I failed Solomon. I failed our Martha by not reaching her." Solomon nudged Joseph's arm with his nose, pulling him momentarily back to reality. Joseph blinked, disoriented, then patted the horse's neck gratefully. "Still looking after me, aren't you? Even now?" The sun began its descent, bringing marginal relief from the heat. Joseph's conditions stabilized somewhat as the temperature dropped, and he found the strength to make one last trip to the spring. The water revived him enough to tend to Solomon again, checking the horse for any signs of further distress. To Joseph's surprise, Solomon seemed better than he had that morning. The horse's breathing was stronger, his eyes more alert, and his attempts to shift position more deliberate. Joseph dared to hope that with another night's rest, Solomon might actually manage to stand the next day. "You're not giving up," Joseph said, a note of pride in his voice. "That's good. Neither am I." As darkness fell once more, Joseph settled beside Solomon, sharing the blanket and his body heat. The night air grew cold quickly, and Joseph shivered despite the warmth of the horse beside him. Above them, the stars emerged again, countless and indifferent to the struggle playing out beneath them. Joseph found himself thinking of his life, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and failures. He had lived a good, honest life, even if it had ended in loss. He had loved deeply, worked hard, and faced challenges with dignity. If this road was to be his final resting place, at least he wasn't alone. Solomon, his faithful companion through it all, was with him to the end. "We've had a good run, you and I," Joseph whispered, his hand resting on Solomon's neck. "No regrets, old friend, no regrets." But as sleep began to claim him once more, Joseph realized he did have one regret, that he had pushed Solomon too hard, driven by his own desperation. If they survived this ordeal, he vowed to never again put his needs above those of the animals in his care. It was a lesson learned too late, perhaps, but one he would carry in his heart for whatever time he had left. The third morning dawned with an unexpected mercy. Clouds. Joseph woke to find the sky veiled in a thin layer of gray that diffused the harsh sunlight. The relief was immediate, if minor. His parched lips cracked into a smile as he gazed upward. "Look at that, Solomon," he croaked. "The good Lord's given us some shade today." Solomon's response was more than Joseph could have hoped for. The horse had shifted position during the night and now lay with his legs tucked under him, head raised, alert and watching Joseph with bright eyes. It was the posture of a horse preparing to rise. "Well, look at you," Joseph said, a surge of hope rising in his chest. He moved closer, wincing at the pain in his joints. "You're feeling better today, aren't you, old friend?" Solomon nickered softly, the sound stronger than it had been the previous day. Joseph placed a hand on the horse's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath his fingers. 3 days ago, he would have taken such a simple thing for granted. Now it felt like a miracle. "Let's get you some water, and then maybe you can try to stand," Joseph suggested, reaching for the canteen. He helped Solomon drink, then took a modest sip himself. The water supply was running dangerously low again, but the clouds overhead gave Joseph hope that he might be spared another brutal journey to the spring. After Solomon had drunk his fill, Joseph sat back and watched as the horse began to make deliberate movements. First, Solomon stretched his front legs, then shifted his weight, preparing to rise. Joseph held his breath, not daring to hope, yet unable to stop himself. "Easy now," he murmured. "Take your time." With visible effort, Solomon gathered his strength and pushed upward. For a heart-stopping moment, Joseph thought he would succeed. The horse's powerful shoulders lifted, his front legs straightened, and he seemed poised to stand. Then, just as victory seemed within reach, Solomon's strength faltered. A tremor ran through his body, and he sank back down with a soft groan that seemed to carry all the disappointment Joseph felt. "It's all right," Joseph said quickly, moving to stroke Solomon's neck. "It's all right, old boy. That was a good try. A real good try. We'll rest a bit, then maybe try again later." Joseph's words were encouraging, but his heart sank. He had hoped so desperately that today would bring the breakthrough they needed. Without Solomon on his feet, they remained stranded, their situation growing more dire with each passing hour. Joseph's own condition was deteriorating rapidly. The brief moments of dizziness had become more frequent, and a deep fatigue had settled into his bones that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. As the morning wore on, the clouds thickened, bringing a blessed respite from the relentless sun, but also a worrying change in the air. Joseph, who had spent a lifetime reading the skies, recognized the signs. A storm was brewing. "Might get some rain," he told Solomon, trying to sound positive, though his mind raced with new concerns. Rain would mean water, a blessing they desperately needed, but it would also mean exposure to the elements with little shelter, mud that could further complicate Solomon's attempts to rise, and potentially dangerous conditions if the storm turned severe. Joseph glanced at his cart, still positioned atop the rise as a signal for help. If a storm came, would it be visible enough? Would anyone even be traveling in such weather? The questions piled up, each one adding to the weight of worry Joseph carried. By midday, the first raindrops began to fall, fat, heavy drops that raised small puffs of dust where they hit the parched earth. Joseph, who had been dozing fitfully beside Solomon, startled awake at the sensation of water on his face. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, then reality settled in as the drops became more frequent. "Rain, Solomon," he said, a mixture of relief and concern in his voice. "We need to get you some cover." Joseph struggled to his feet, fighting a wave of dizziness that threatened to send him back to the ground. He retrieved the blanket and his coat, fashioning a makeshift shelter over Solomon's head and back. It wasn't much, but it might keep the worst of the rain off. The storm intensified quickly. What had started as scattered drops became a steady downpour within minutes. The road, so dusty and unyielding before, turned slick and muddy. Joseph, with no shelter for himself, was soaked to the skin almost immediately. The rain was cool, too cool. His body, already weakened by sun exposure and dehydration, began to shiver uncontrollably. Yet amidst the discomfort, Joseph recognized an opportunity. He set out the pail and canteen, letting them fill with rainwater. He even stripped off his shirt and spread it on the ground, planning to wring the collected water into their containers once it was saturated. Each small action was a victory against the elements that seemed determined to break them. "We'll get through this," he told Solomon, his teeth chattering as he worked. "This rain is a blessing, even if it doesn't feel like one right now." Solomon seemed less bothered by the rain than Joseph had feared. The horse's coat shed water naturally, and the makeshift shelter kept his head relatively dry. Most importantly, Solomon continued to show signs of improvement, shifting more frequently and making small attempts to reposition himself. As the afternoon progressed, the storm showed no signs of abating. The temperature dropped further and Joseph's shivering became more violent. He knew the dangers of cold exposure, especially in his weakened state. Hypothermia was as real a threat now as heat stroke had been hours earlier. In a desperate bid to keep warm, Joseph pressed himself against Solomon's flank, seeking the horse's body heat. Solomon, perhaps sensing Joseph's need, remained still, allowing the man to huddle close. "Never thought I'd be so grateful for your warmth," Joseph murmured through chattering teeth. "Seems like you're saving me now, not the other way around." As darkness began to fall, the rain finally started to ease, though the clouds remained, promising more through the night. Joseph, moving with the sluggishness of extreme fatigue and cold, collected their now full water containers, and brought them under the minimal shelter with Solomon. "We won't go thirsty for a while," he said, trying to find silver linings. "And the spring will be flowing stronger tomorrow." But tomorrow seemed very far away as night descended fully, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that penetrated Joseph's wet clothes and settled into his very core. He huddled closer to Solomon, pulling the edge of the blanket over himself as best he could. It was damp, but better than nothing. In the darkness, with rain still pattering softly around them and his body racked with shivers, Joseph's mind drifted to Martha again. He imagined her warm kitchen, the smell of bread baking, the sound of her children, his grandchildren playing nearby. The image was so vivid he could almost feel the warmth of her stove, almost taste the hot tea she would press into his hands. "We should have been there by now, Solomon," he whispered. "She'll be worried sick." Solomon shifted slightly, pressing back against Joseph as if in reassurance. The small movement brought Joseph back from his reverie, reminding him of their dire reality. They were alone on a muddy road in the rain, miles from help, both of them in a perilous state. As Joseph drifted into an uneasy sleep, his last conscious thought was a prayer, not for himself, but for Solomon. The horse had given everything for him over the years. If only one of them could survive this ordeal, Joseph hoped it would be his faithful friend. "Live, old boy," he murmured as consciousness slipped away. "Even if I don't, you live." Joseph's consciousness returned slowly, like a reluctant swimmer rising to the surface of a dark lake. His first sensation was heat, not the burning heat of the sun, but the insidious internal heat of fever. His clothes, still damp from the previous night's rain, clung to his skin uncomfortably. Every breath felt like an effort, each inhale sending a stab of pain through his chest. "Solomon," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The horse lay beside him, awake and alert, his eyes watching Joseph with what seemed like concern. Solomon's head was raised higher than it had been the previous day, another small but significant improvement. Joseph tried to smile, though his cracked lips made the gesture painful. "Morning," he managed. "You're looking better." Joseph attempted to sit up but found the simple movement almost impossible. His limbs felt extraordinarily heavy, as if weighted down with stones. When he finally managed to prop himself up, the world spun alarmingly, forcing him to close his eyes until the sensation passed. The clouds from yesterday had cleared, revealing a sky of perfect, cruel blue. The sun had not yet reached its full strength, but already Joseph could feel its heat beginning to dry the mud around them. In a few hours, the ground would be baked hard again, all evidence of the rain erased except for the precious water they had collected. Joseph reached for the canteen with trembling hands, taking a small sip before offering it to Solomon. The horse drank eagerly, a good sign. But as Joseph watched, he noticed something else, a new alertness in Solomon's movements, a gathering tension in his powerful muscles. "What is it, boy?" Joseph asked, sensing the change. "You feeling strong enough to try again?" As if in answer, Solomon began to shift, drawing his legs under his body with deliberate care. Joseph held his breath, hope and fear mingling in his chest. He wanted desperately for Solomon to succeed, yet feared the disappointment of another failure. "Easy now," he encouraged. "Take your time." Solomon's first attempt was hesitant, a tentative pushing against the ground that raised his front quarters briefly before he settled back down. But instead of giving up, the horse seemed to gather his resolve. On the second attempt, Solomon pushed harder, his muscles straining visibly beneath his hide. His front legs straightened, taking weight, while his hindquarters still lay in the mud. "That's it," Joseph whispered, hardly daring to move lest he break the spell of the moment. "That's it, Solomon." With a tremendous effort that Joseph could feel in his own weary bones, Solomon heaved himself upward. For a breathless moment he teetered, half standing, seemingly caught between rising and falling. Then, with a final surge of strength, his hind legs found purchase in the mud, and he stood. Solomon stood, trembling, unsteady, but standing. Joseph felt tears spring to his eyes, cutting clean tracks down his dirt-streaked face. "You did it," he said, his voice breaking. "Solomon, you did it." The horse took a tentative step, then another, his movements unsure but determined. He circled slowly, getting reacquainted with his legs, while Joseph watched from the ground, his heart swelling with a joy so fierce it momentarily pushed aside his own physical suffering. But that suffering returned with a vengeance when Joseph tried to stand himself. The fever that had been building through the night now raged in earnest, sapping what little strength he had left. He managed to get to his knees before a fit of coughing doubled him over, each hack feeling like a knife in his lungs. Solomon, hearing Joseph's distress, came to him immediately, standing close as if offering support. Joseph leaned against the horse's leg, grateful for the sturdy presence. "Just need a minute?" Joseph gasped when the coughing subsided. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. This wasn't exhaustion that would pass with rest. This was illness, serious illness, born of days of exposure, malnutrition, and the cold rain of the previous night. With Solomon's solid presence beside him, Joseph eventually managed to stand, though the effort left him dizzy and nauseous. He clung to the horse's mane, breathing in shallow gasps until the worst of the dizziness passed. "Good boy," he murmured, patting Solomon's neck. "Strong boy. You're going to be just fine now." Solomon stood patiently, allowing Joseph to use him for support. The reversal of their situations wasn't lost on Joseph. Days ago, it was Solomon who couldn't stand, dependent on Joseph for everything. Now, as Solomon regained his strength, Joseph found his own failing rapidly. "We need to keep moving," Joseph said, more to himself than to Solomon. Martha's place, not too far now. But the thought of walking even a short distance seemed insurmountable. Joseph wasn't sure he could take a single step without collapsing, let alone lead Solomon down the road. And yet, what choice did they have? To stay meant certain death for Joseph, whose condition was deteriorating by the hour. With monumental effort, Joseph collected their meager supplies, the water containers, his blanket, the few personal items he had brought from the farm. Each movement was agony, each breath a battle. By the time he had secured everything, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the early hour. "We need to get my cart," Joseph told Solomon, glancing up the road to where he had positioned it as a signal. "Then we can continue our journey." He took a step, then another, clinging to Solomon's mane for support. The horse moved with careful deliberation, matching his pace to Joseph's faltering steps. Together they made their way slowly up the slight incline toward the cart. The journey, barely 100 yards, felt like miles to Joseph. By the time they reached the cart, his vision was blurring at the edges and the ringing in his ears had become a constant drone. Still, he pushed forward, driven by the same stubborn determination that had sustained him all his life. With shaking hands, Joseph began to hitch the cart back to Solomon. The task that would normally take minutes stretched into an hour as Joseph fumbled with buckles and straps, his fever-addled mind struggling to remember the sequence he had performed thousands of times before. Finally, the cart was secured. Joseph stood back, swaying slightly to examine his work. It would hold, he thought, though it wasn't his best effort. He placed their supplies in the cart, then, with Solomon's patient help, climbed up himself. The simple act of sitting upright required all his remaining strength. "All right, Solomon," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Take us to Martha's. You know the way." He loosened the reins, giving Solomon freedom to move at his own pace. The horse began to walk slowly, carefully, as if aware of Joseph's fragile state and the need to avoid jarring the cart. As they resumed their journey, Joseph felt a strange mix of hope and resignation. Solomon was on his feet again, a miracle he had prayed for, but his own condition was grave, and he knew it. The fever burned through him, consuming his reserves, and the pain in his chest suggested an infection had taken hold in his lungs. "Just get me to Martha's," Joseph murmured, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Just that far. The sun climbed higher, its heat beating down on them once more. Joseph, fading in and out of consciousness, clung to the edge of the cart. In his lucid moments, he watched Solomon with pride. The horse, though still weak, walked steadily, his head held higher with each passing hour as strength returned to his limbs. "You're going to be fine," Joseph whispered during one such moment of clarity. "You'll have a good home with Martha. She'll take care of you." As noon approached, Joseph slipped deeper into the grip of his fever. The landscape blurred around him, and voices from his past seemed to call from the distance. Ruth, his beloved wife, his parents, long gone, friends who had preceded him in death. Their voices mingled with the creak of the cartwheels and the steady rhythm of Solomon's hooves on the dusty road. In his delirium, Joseph wasn't afraid. There was peace in the knowledge that Solomon would survive, that his faithful friend would reach safety even if he himself did not. It was enough. It had to be enough. The world became a blur of light and shadow, sound and silence. Joseph drifted through realms of consciousness, sometimes aware of the cart's gentle swaying beneath him, other times lost in memories so vivid they seemed more real than the present. The fever painted everything with an unnatural clarity one moment, then washed it away in waves of confusion the next. Solomon continued forward, his pace steady but unhurried. Though still weak from his ordeal, the horse seemed to understand the importance of their journey and the fragility of his master's condition. Each step was deliberate, chosen to minimize the jostling of the cart. When the road roughened, Solomon slowed. When it smoothed, he maintained his careful rhythm, never pushing beyond what his recovering strength could manage. In one of his lucid moments, Joseph became aware of a change in direction. Solomon had reached a fork in the road and without hesitation had taken the right-hand path, the correct route to Martha's farm. Joseph felt a surge of pride through his fever haze. "Good boy," he whispered, the words barely audible. "You remember the way." The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon when Joseph's fever peaked. The heat within him seemed to match the heat without, burning away all coherent thought. He no longer recognized the landscape around them, no longer remembered their purpose or destination. There was only the fire in his blood and the desperate need for water. "Water," he croaked, his tongue thick in his mouth. "Please, water." No one answered. No one was there to answer. In his delirium, Joseph had forgotten that he was alone with Solomon, miles from any human assistance. He fumbled weakly at his side, searching for the canteen that was secured in the cart beneath him. His fingers, numb and uncooperative, couldn't find the strap that held it. Solomon, sensing the change in Joseph's movements, stopped. The horse turned his head, looking back at the cart with ears perked forward attentively. Joseph met the animal's gaze, momentarily anchored by those deep, knowing eyes. "Solomon," he breathed, "need water." The horse couldn't understand the specific words, of course, but he seemed to sense Joseph's distress. After a moment of stillness, Solomon began walking again, his pace slightly quicker than before, though still mindful of the cart's motion. Time lost all meaning for Joseph. The landscape shifted and blurred around him, open road giving way to scattered trees, then more dense vegetation as Solomon followed the path that led toward Martha's property. Joseph recognized none of it, lost in the wilderness of his illness. The fever brought visions. Ruth walked beside the cart, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch Joseph's brow with cooling fingers. "Not long now," she seemed to say, though her lips didn't move. "You've done so well, my love." "Ruth," Joseph whispered, reaching for her. But his hand passed through empty air, and she was gone, like mist in sunlight. Other figures from his past appeared and vanished. His father, stern but proud, his mother with her gentle smile and work-worn hands, childhood friends, neighbors long moved away or passed on. They kept him company as Solomon carried him forward, their silent presence a comfort in his suffering. As afternoon deepened toward evening, Solomon came to a stream that cut across their path. In healthier times, they would have crossed without a second thought, the shallow water barely reaching Solomon's fetlocks, but the horse, still recovering his strength, approached with caution. He stopped at the edge, assessing the crossing. Joseph, roused by the halt in movement, forced his eyes open. Through the haze of fever, he saw the water gleaming in the late sunlight. "Water," he murmured, the sight awakening his desperate thirst. Solomon stepped carefully into the stream, the cool water swirling around his legs. The cart followed, its wheels splashing softly. Halfway across, the horse paused, turning his head back toward Joseph as if checking on him. With effort born of desperation, Joseph pushed himself up on trembling arms and reached over the side of the cart. His fingers brushed the surface of the stream, sending ripples outward. Water. Life-giving water. He cupped his hand, managing to capture a small amount, and brought it to his parched lips. It wasn't much, but the coolness was a blessing against his fever-hot skin. Solomon remained patiently still as Joseph reached down again and again, each handful of water a small victory against the inferno raging within him. After the fifth or sixth handful, Joseph fell back into the cart, exhausted by the simple effort but marginally revived. The water had cleared his mind, if only temporarily. "Thank you," he whispered to Solomon, though whether he was thanking the horse for stopping or some higher power for the stream itself, even Joseph wasn't sure. Solomon completed the crossing, his steps even more careful on the slippery exit from the stream. Once on solid ground, he resumed their journey, the path now leading upward along a gentle rise that Joseph, in his more lucid state, recognized as the final approach to Martha's farm. The recognition brought a surge of hope so powerful it momentarily pushed back the fever's grip. "We're almost there," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in hours. "Solomon, we're going to make it." The horse's ears flicked back at the sound of Joseph's voice, perhaps responding to the new energy he heard there. His pace quickened slightly, though still mindful of Joseph's fragile state. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber, Solomon crested the rise. Below them lay a small valley, and nestled within it, the modest farmhouse that belonged to Martha and her family. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting a warm hearth and the evening meal being prepared. A few chickens pecked in the yard, and a milk cow dozed in a small pasture nearby. It was a scene of such ordinary domestic tranquility that Joseph felt tears spring to his eyes. "There it is," he whispered. "We made it, Solomon. We made it." But the emotion and exertion had depleted his brief reserves of strength. As Solomon began the careful descent toward the farm, Joseph slipped back into the grip of his fever. His vision tunneled, darkness encroaching from all sides until only a pinpoint of light remained, and then that too was gone. In the darkness of unconsciousness, Joseph heard Ruth's voice once more, clearer than before. "Rest now," she seemed to say. "You've brought him home. You've done what you set out to do." Joseph surrendered to the darkness, his last conscious thought a prayer of gratitude that Solomon, at least, would be safe. Solomon continued down the path toward the farmhouse, his gait steady despite his exhaustion. The scent of hay and livestock, of cooking food and wood smoke, familiar, welcoming smells guided him forward. Behind him in the cart, Joseph lay still and silent, his breathing shallow, his skin burning with fever. As they approached the yard, a figure emerged from the house, a woman in her early 40s, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face bearing the unmistakable resemblance to Joseph that marked her as his daughter. Martha's expression changed from curiosity to alarm as she recognized the horse and cart and the still figure within. She dropped the dish towel she had been holding and ran toward them, calling over her shoulder for her husband and sons. "Father!" she cried, reaching the cart just as Solomon came to a stop, as if the horse knew his journey was finally complete. "Oh my God, Father!" Martha's hands trembled as she touched her father's face, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from his skin. "Thomas," she called again, her voice sharp with fear. "Hurry!" Her husband appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. One look at the scene before him, the exhausted horse, the still figure in the cart, and he broke into a run. Close behind him came their two sons, Michael and James, teenagers with their grandfather's strong build and serious eyes. "He's burning with fever," Martha said as Thomas reached her side. "And Solomon looks half dead himself. What happened to them?" Thomas didn't waste time on speculation. "Michael, take care of Solomon. Get him to the stable, water, and feed. But go easy. He looks worn out. James, help me with your grandfather. We need to get him inside, now." The family moved with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to emergencies. Michael approached Solomon carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones as he took the horse's bridle. Solomon, recognizing he was finally among friends, allowed himself to be led toward the stable, his steps heavy with exhaustion, but his head held high, as if aware he had completed his vital mission. Thomas and James gently lifted Joseph from the cart. He was alarmingly light in their arms, his once solid frame diminished by days of deprivation. His skin burned against theirs, and his breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps that spoke of the infection gripping his lungs. "Quickly," Martha urged, leading the way to the house. "Bring him to the spare room." Inside, they laid Joseph on the bed that had been prepared for his expected visit, though none of them had imagined he would arrive in such a state. Martha immediately began removing his filthy, sweat-soaked clothing, while Thomas went to fetch water and clean linens. "James, ride for Dr. Henderson," Martha instructed her younger son. "Tell him it's urgent. Pneumonia, I think, and severe dehydration. Go now." The boy nodded and ran from the room, boots thumping on the wooden floors and then down the porch steps. Moments later, they heard the sound of hoofbeats as he galloped down the lane toward town. Martha worked methodically, her initial panic giving way to focused determination. She bathed her father's face and body with cool water, changed him into clean nightclothes, and propped him up on pillows to ease his labored breathing. All the while, she spoke to him in a gentle voice, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. "You're safe now, Father," she murmured, wringing out a cloth and placing it on his forehead. "You're home with us. Everything's going to be all right." Joseph showed no sign of hearing her words. His face, deeply tanned from years in the sun, now had an alarming pallor beneath the sunburn and fever flush. His cheeks had hollowed, and his lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Martha carefully spooned small amounts of water into his mouth, relieved when he instinctively swallowed. "What do you think happened?" Thomas asked quietly, standing at the foot of the bed. Martha shook her head. "I don't know. He was supposed to arrive 3 days ago. Something must have delayed them on the road." She looked up at her husband, worry etched into her features. Solomon looked terrible too, but he was standing. Father wasn't even conscious when they arrived. Solomon brought him here, Thomas said, realization dawning in his voice. That horse brought him all this way. Martha nodded slowly, the implications sinking in. He must have. Father couldn't have directed him, not in this state. The magnitude of what Solomon had done, navigating miles of road while exhausted and recovering from his own ordeal, all while carefully transporting his gravely ill master, left them both momentarily speechless. It was a feat of loyalty and intelligence that defied simple explanation. That horse deserves the best care we can give him, Thomas said finally. He saved Father's life, Martha agreed. As if summoned by their words, Michael appeared in the doorway. Solomon's settled in the stable, he reported. I gave him water and a little feed, like you said. He's tired but doesn't seem injured, just worn out. His legs are steady, no swelling that I can see. Good, Thomas said. Keep an eye on him. Don't let him overeat or drink too much at once. We'll check on him again after we've seen to your grandfather. Michael nodded and glanced anxiously at Joseph. Will Grandpa be okay? Martha wished she could give her son a reassuring answer, but the truth was she didn't know. Joseph's condition was critical. His age, combined with what must have been days of exposure and illness, made his recovery far from certain. We're doing everything we can, she said instead. Dr. Henderson will be here soon. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Dr. Henderson arrived, his face grave as he examined Joseph. The diagnosis confirmed Martha's fears. Pneumonia, severe dehydration, and exhaustion, all compounded by Joseph's advanced age. I won't lie to you, Martha, the doctor said quietly as they stepped outside the sick room. It's very serious. His lungs are badly congested, and the fever has weakened him considerably. The next 48 hours will be critical. Martha nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. What can we do? Keep him cool to fight the fever. Get as much water into him as you can, a few spoonfuls at a time. I've left medicine to help with the congestion and infection. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. And pray, Martha. Your father is strong, but he's been through a terrible ordeal. After the doctor left, the family established a rotation for Joseph's care. There would be someone with him at all times, monitoring his fever, administering medicine, and ensuring he received small, regular amounts of water and broth when he could swallow. As evening deepened into night, Martha took the first watch. She sat beside her father's bed, the room lit only by a single lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. Outside, the familiar sounds of the farm, the lowing of cattle being settled for the night, the distant bark of their dog, created a peaceful backdrop that contrasted sharply with the gravity of the situation inside. Martha held her father's hand, his calloused palm hot and dry against her skin. She thought of all the times these hands had guided her, protected her, taught her the ways of the farm and of life. The thought that they might soon be still forever was unbearable. Don't leave us, Father, she whispered. We need you still. A soft nickering from outside drew Martha's attention to the window. Looking out, she saw Solomon in the paddock nearest the house. Though he should have been resting in the stable, the horse had somehow made his way to the enclosure closest to Joseph's window. He stood there now, head raised, eyes fixed on the light from Joseph's room, as if keeping vigil. The sight brought fresh tears to Martha's eyes. Even now, separated by walls and distance, Solomon's connection to Joseph remained unbroken. The horse sensed that his master was fighting for his life and had positioned himself as close as possible, standing guard as Joseph had done for him just days before. He knows, Martha said softly. He's watching over Father, just as Father watched over him. Through the night, as Martha tended to Joseph's fever and prayed for his recovery, Solomon remained at his post, a silent sentinel beneath the stars. Two beings, human and animal, bound by a love and loyalty that transcended words, each having saved the other, each now waiting to learn if their journey together would continue or if this was to be their final chapter. Dawn broke over the farm, bathing the fields in soft golden light. Inside the house, Thomas took over Joseph's care from his exhausted wife, insisting she get some rest. As Martha reluctantly left the sick room, she paused at the window and looked out. Solomon remained in the paddock, standing in almost the exact same position as the night before, his gaze fixed on the house. "He hasn't moved all night," she told Thomas. "Not to eat or drink or rest." Thomas joined her at the window, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted. "That horse understands more than any animal I've ever known." Throughout the day, Joseph's condition remained precarious. His fever climbed higher, and his breathing grew more labored. Dr. Henderson returned in the afternoon, his expression grim as he listened to Joseph's chest. "The infection is worsening," he said quietly. "We need to try to break this fever." Under the doctor's instruction, they wrapped Joseph in cool, damp sheets, changing them frequently as his body heat quickly warmed them. They spooned broth and water between his cracked lips whenever possible, though most times the liquid dribbled down his chin. Each breath seemed to cost him tremendous effort, his chest rising and falling in an irregular rhythm that frightened Martha more than she wanted to admit. In his delirium, Joseph called out, sometimes to Ruth, other times to Solomon. Occasionally, he would become agitated, trying to rise from the bed as if he needed to continue some urgent journey. "Solomon," he would mumble, his hands plucking at the sheets. "Need to help Solomon. He's fallen. Can't get up." Martha would soothe him then, holding his hand and assuring him that Solomon was safe, that he had done his duty, that he could rest now. Sometimes her words would calm him, and he would sink back into unconsciousness. Other times, nothing seemed to reach him, and they would have to gently restrain him to prevent him from harming himself. Outside, Michael tended to Solomon with the same devotion that the family showed to Joseph. The young man brought water and feed to the paddock since Solomon refused to return to the stable. He brushed the horse's coat, speaking quietly to him all the while, telling him about his grandfather's condition. "He's fighting hard," Michael would say, "just like you did. You need to keep your strength up too, Solomon. Grandpa will want to see you when he wakes up." Whether it was these words or some internal understanding, Solomon finally began to accept nourishment, though he still would not leave his self-appointed post. He would eat from the bucket Michael brought, drink from the trough that had been filled for him, and then return to his position facing Joseph's window. On the second night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Martha sat with her father, dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth. His condition had neither improved nor worsened, leaving the family in a painful limbo of hope and fear. The doctor had said the fact that Joseph had survived this long was a positive sign, but Martha could see how tenuous his grip on life remained. As the first rumbles of thunder sounded in the distance, Joseph became agitated again, muttering about rain and shelter. "Need to cover Solomon," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in hours. "Rain's coming. He'll get cold." "Solomon is safe, Father," Martha assured him. "He has shelter if he wants it." But Joseph's agitation only increased as the storm grew closer. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the room in stark white light, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. Joseph's eyes flew open, clearer and more aware than they had been since his arrival. "Solomon," he said, his gaze fixing on Martha. "Where is he? Is he all right?" Martha was startled by this sudden lucidity. "Yes, Father, he's fine. He's in the paddock by your window. He won't leave. He's been watching over you." Joseph turned his head toward the window, though from his position in bed he couldn't see outside. "He saved me," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I tried to save him when he collapsed, but in the end, He saved me." Martha's heart clenched at these words, the first hint of what had happened on their journey. "You both saved each other," she said gently. "And now, you're both safe." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed almost immediately by a crash of thunder that shook the house. The storm was directly overhead now. Rain began to pelt against the window, driven by gusts of wind that moaned around the corners of the house. A different sound cut through the storm noise, a frantic, frightened whinny. Martha rushed to the window in time to see Solomon rearing in the paddock, clearly terrified by the thunder. "He's scared," she told Joseph, who had tried to sit up at the sound of the horse's distress. "The storm—" "Go to him," Joseph urged, his voice surprisingly strong. "Please, Martha, he's been through so much. He needs someone with him." Martha hesitated, torn between her father's bedside and the frightened horse. "I can't leave you, Father." "I'll be fine," Joseph insisted. "Solomon needs you now, please." Thomas appeared in the doorway, summoned by the commotion. "What's happening?" "Solomon's panicking in the storm," Martha explained. "Father wants me to go to him, but—" "Go," Thomas said firmly. "I'll stay with your father." Grateful, Martha grabbed her coat and rushed outside into the driving rain. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet as she made her way to the paddock. Solomon was still rearing and pacing, his eyes wide with fear, his nostrils flared. Each crack of thunder sent him into a new panic. "Solomon!" Martha called, approaching the fence cautiously. "Easy, boy. Easy now." The horse turned toward her voice, recognizing her, but still frightened. Martha entered the paddock slowly, speaking in a calm, steady voice, despite the chaos of the storm around them. "It's all right," she soothed, moving closer, inch by inch. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." When she finally reached Solomon, she placed a gentle hand on his neck. The horse trembled beneath her touch but didn't pull away. Martha stood with him, her hand maintaining that constant, reassuring contact as the storm raged around them. Gradually, Solomon's trembling subsided, though he still flinched at the loudest thunder. "That's it," Martha encouraged. "You're doing so well. My father is so proud of you, Solomon, so proud of your courage." As if he understood her words, Solomon lowered his head and nudged Martha's shoulder gently. The gesture was so human, so filled with intelligence and emotion, that Martha felt tears spring to her eyes despite the rain already streaming down her face. "He loves you so much," she told the horse. "He sent me out here because he couldn't bear for you to be afraid. Even now, as sick as he is, he's thinking of you." The rain soaked them both, but Martha remained with Solomon until the worst of the storm had passed. By the time she led him to the shelter of the stable, persuading him at last to come in from the weather, her clothes were plastered to her skin and her hair hung in wet ropes around her face. Solomon allowed himself to be settled in a stall with fresh hay and water, perhaps finally convinced that he could temporarily abandon his vigil without betraying his duty to Joseph. Martha stroked his nose one last time before hurrying back to the house. When she entered Joseph's room, dripping water onto the floor, she found her father awake and alert, his eyes anxious as they searched her face. "Solomon?" he asked immediately. "He's fine," Martha assured him, moving to his bedside despite her sodden state. "He's in the stable now, dry and safe." Joseph closed his eyes briefly, relief evident in every line of his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Martha took his hand, noticing with a surge of hope that it felt cooler than before. "Father," she said carefully, "your fever, I think it's breaking." Thomas, who had been watching Joseph while Martha was outside, nodded in confirmation. "It started to come down about the time you went out to Solomon. It's still high, but not dangerously so anymore." Martha placed her palm on Joseph's forehead, feeling the difference for herself. The burning heat had subsided to a milder warmth. His breathing, too, seemed less labored, though still far from normal. "The crisis has passed, I think," Thomas said quietly. Joseph's eyes, clearer now, found Martha's. "Tell me about Solomon," he said. "How is he really?" Martha smiled through her tears. "Recovering just like you. He wouldn't leave the paddock outside your window until tonight. He's been standing guard watching over you." A ghost of a smile touched Joseph's lips. "We watched over each other," he murmured. "On the road, when he fell, I thought I would lose him. Then when I fell ill, he brought me home." His voice broke on the last word. The breaking of Joseph's fever marked the beginning of his long journey back to health. Though the worst had passed, recovery would be measured in weeks rather than days. The infection in his lungs had taken a severe toll, leaving him weak as a newborn calf and prone to fits of coughing that racked his frail body and left him gasping for breath. Each morning, Joseph's first question was always the same: "How is Solomon today?" And each morning, Martha or one of her sons would provide a detailed report on the horse's condition. His appetite, his energy level, whether he'd returned to the paddock outside Joseph's window, which he did faithfully each day after spending the night in the stable. "He's getting stronger every day," Martha assured her father a week after their arrival. "Michael says he's almost back to normal weight, and his coat is starting to shine again." Joseph nodded, satisfaction evident in his tired eyes. "He was so thin when he collapsed," he said softly. "I thought I'd driven him to his death." Martha sat on the edge of the bed, taking her father's hand. "Will you tell me what happened out there on the road?" Joseph was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he remembered. Then, slowly, haltingly, he began to tell the story of Solomon's collapse from exhaustion, of the days spent nursing him beside the road, of the rain and his own illness, and finally, of Solomon's recovery and determination to bring Joseph to safety even as fever consumed him. "He could have left me," Joseph said, his voice breaking. "Once he was strong enough to stand, he could have wandered off to find food and water for himself. Instead, he stayed. He pulled the cart with me in it when I was too weak to sit up. He found the way here when I couldn't guide him." He looked at Martha, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He saved my life, Martha. After all I'd asked of him, after pushing him until he collapsed, he saved me." Martha squeezed her father's hand, her own eyes wet. "You saved each other," she said gently. "You stayed with him when he couldn't stand, and he brought you home when you couldn't. That's love, Father, the purest kind." As days turned into weeks, Joseph's strength gradually returned. He progressed from being confined to bed to sitting up for short periods, then to taking tentative steps around the room with Martha or Thomas supporting him. His appetite improved, and color returned to his once ashen face. The hollow look in his cheeks began to fill out as Martha plied him with nourishing soups and fresh bread. Yet despite his progress, a restlessness grew in Joseph. He spent increasing amounts of time at the window, watching Solomon in the paddock below. The horse had made a remarkable recovery, almost back to his former strength and vitality. Each day, Solomon would stand for hours looking up at Joseph's window, sometimes nickering softly as if calling to his old friend. "I need to see him properly," Joseph told Martha one afternoon in late October, nearly a month after their arrival. "Not just through glass. I need to touch him to let him know I'm all right." Martha hesitated. Joseph was still frail, the stairs to the ground floor a significant challenge on their own, let alone the walk to the paddock. "Father, I'm not sure you're strong enough yet." "Please, Martha," Joseph interrupted, his voice firm despite its weakness. "This is important, to both of us." Martha searched her father's face, seeing the determination there, the same stubborn will that had kept him alive on the road, that had given him the strength to care for Solomon when many would have abandoned the horse. She nodded slowly. "All right," she conceded, "but not alone. Thomas and the boys will help you, and we'll take it slow." The expedition was planned with the care of a military campaign. Thomas and Michael would support Joseph on either side, while James went ahead to bring Solomon to the porch, eliminating the need for Joseph to walk all the way to the paddock. They would do it at midday, when the autumn sun would provide warmth without the harshness of summer heat. When the day arrived, Joseph insisted on dressing in proper clothes rather than the nightshirts he'd worn during his convalescence. His hands trembled as he buttoned his shirt, and Martha had to help him with his suspenders, but there was dignity in the effort that brought tears to her eyes. "You look handsome, Father," she said, smoothing his collar. "Solomon will be pleased to see you on your feet." The journey downstairs was arduous. Joseph's legs, weakened by weeks of illness and bed rest, trembled beneath him despite Thomas and Michael's strong support. Each step was a victory of will over body, his face set in lines of concentration and determination. By the time they reached the bottom, sweat beaded on his brow and his breathing had quickened dangerously. "Do you need to rest?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. Joseph shook his head. "No, I'm almost there. I can rest afterward." The front door stood open, autumn sunlight streaming onto the porch. Beyond it, James waited with Solomon, the horse alert and attentive, his ears pricked forward as if he sensed the importance of the moment. With Thomas and Michael still supporting him, Joseph made his way through the door and onto the porch. The fresh air, the first he'd breathed in a month, filled his lungs, bringing a momentary spell of dizziness that he fought back through sheer force of will. And then he saw Solomon. The horse stood at the bottom of the porch steps, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, his body filled out once more, strong and healthy. But it was his eyes that caught Joseph's attention. Those deep, intelligent eyes that had watched over him on the road, that had somehow known the way to Martha's farm when Joseph himself was lost in fever dreams. "Solomon," Joseph whispered, his voice breaking. The horse's reaction was immediate. His head came up, ears fully alert, and he nickered, a soft, joyful sound of recognition. Without waiting for James's guidance, Solomon moved to the bottom of the steps, as close as he could get to Joseph without climbing the porch himself. "Let me go to him," Joseph said, gently pulling away from Thomas and Michael's support. "Father," Martha began, alarmed. "Just to the railing," Joseph assured her. "I'll hold on. I need to touch him." Reluctantly, they helped him to the porch railing, where Joseph gripped the weathered wood with one hand while extending the other toward Solomon. The horse stretched his neck, reaching upward until his muzzle touched Joseph's outstretched palm. The contact was electric. Joseph felt tears spill down his cheeks as Solomon's soft breath warmed his hand. The horse nuzzled against him, nickering again in what could only be described as happiness. "Hello, old friend," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing me home." Solomon pressed his head more firmly against Joseph's hand, as if trying to get closer despite the barrier of the porch railing. The horse's eyes never left Joseph's face, and in them, Joseph saw something that transcended the usual bond between man and animal, a recognition and understanding, a shared experience that had forged something unbreakable between them. Martha, watching from the doorway, felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had never witnessed anything like the connection between her father and Solomon, two beings who had faced death together and emerged somehow stronger, their bond deepened by mutual sacrifice. "I told you we'd make it," Joseph said softly to Solomon, stroking the white star on his forehead. "Both of us. Together." Solomon stood perfectly still, soaking in Joseph's touch as if it were life-giving water after a long drought. There was a peacefulness to the horse now that hadn't been there before, the restlessness of his paddock vigil replaced by a serene contentment now that he could see and touch his friend once more. For Joseph, too, something settled in that moment of reunion. The lingering fear that had haunted his recovery, that somehow Solomon might still suffer for what they'd endured, eased as he saw the vitality return to his faithful companion. They had both survived. They had both healed. And in that healing, their journey had come full circle. As autumn deepened toward winter, the landscape around Martha's farm transformed. Trees that had been green when Joseph and Solomon arrived now blazed with color before surrendering their leaves to the increasingly chill winds. The fields, harvested under Thomas's careful management, lay fallow and waiting for their winter sleep. Life on the farm settled into the familiar rhythm of the changing seasons, a rhythm that now included Joseph and Solomon as permanent fixtures. Joseph's recovery continued steadily, though Dr. Henderson warned that his lungs would likely never be quite the same. The pneumonia was severe, he explained during a follow-up visit. You'll need to be careful in cold weather, and another bout of it could be dangerous at your age. Joseph accepted this news with the same quiet dignity with which he had faced every challenge in his life. He had survived, when by all rights he should have perished on that lonely road. Every day beyond that was a gift, not something to be mourned for its limitations. As his strength returned, Joseph found ways to contribute to the farm's operation. He couldn't handle the heavy work anymore, plowing or harvesting or building, but his decades of farming experience made him an invaluable advisor. Thomas, who had married into farming rather than being born to it, sought Joseph's counsel on crop rotation, livestock breeding, and the 1,000 other decisions that determined a farm's success or failure. "You should plant the north field in alfalfa next spring," Joseph suggested one evening as they sat around the dinner table. "The soil there is depleting. Alfalfa will replenish it and provide good feed for the livestock." Thomas nodded, respecting Joseph's wisdom. "I've been thinking the same thing. The yields were down this year compared to last." These conversations brought Joseph a satisfaction he hadn't expected to find after losing his own farm. Though the land wasn't his anymore, his knowledge and experience still mattered, still had value. It was a different kind of legacy than the one he had envisioned, but no less meaningful. Solomon, too, found his place in the fabric of Martha's farm. After his remarkable recovery, the horse's strength and intelligence made him invaluable for work in the fields. Thomas, recognizing Solomon's special status, never pushed him too hard or for too long. The horse worked willingly, seemingly glad to be useful again, but everyone understood that Solomon was more than just a work animal. He was family. The bond between Joseph and Solomon remained something of a wonder to those who witnessed it. Each morning, regardless of weather, Joseph would make his way to the stable to greet Solomon before breakfast. They would walk together afterward, slowly at first as Joseph built his stamina, then for longer distances as his strength improved. These walks became a familiar sight on the farm. The elderly man and his faithful horse moving at an unhurried pace through fields and along the lane, companionable and content in each other's presence. "It's like they're having conversations," Michael remarked to his mother one day, watching from the barn as Joseph paused to show Solomon something in his hand. A particularly interesting stone or plant, perhaps. Solomon bent his head to examine whatever Joseph held, then raised it again as if in response to an unheard question. "I think they are, in their own way," Martha replied. "They understand each other better than most people understand their fellow humans." Winter arrived with a heavy snowfall in early December. Joseph, now settled in a room on the ground floor that Martha and Thomas had converted for him, watched through his window as the world disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Solomon, ensconced in the warm stable with the other horses, was temporarily out of sight, though never out of mind. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered in the parlor around a small tree the boys had cut from the woodlot. Presents were few and simple: Hand-knitted scarves, carved wooden figures, preserved fruits from the summer's harvest, but the warmth of family made them precious beyond measure. Joseph, seated in a comfortable chair near the fire, watched his daughter and her family with quiet joy. He had lost much in the past year, his farm, his health, very nearly his life, but what remained was, perhaps, what mattered most: family, purpose, the knowledge that his life had meaning, even if that meaning had changed shape. "I have something for you, Father," Martha said, placing a small package in his hands. "It's not much, but I thought you might like it." Joseph unwrapped the gift carefully, his fingers still not as nimble as they once had been. Inside the paper lay a simple wooden frame, and within it, a photograph. Joseph caught his breath as he recognized the image, himself and Solomon, captured during one of their morning walks. He hadn't even been aware the picture was being taken. In it, Joseph stood with one hand on Solomon's neck, both of them gazing at something in the distance, their profiles almost mirror images of quiet contemplation. "James took it with Mr. Henderson's camera when he was here last month," Martha explained. "He thought you might want a memento." Joseph ran a finger gently over the image, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," he finally managed. "It's perfect." Later that night, after the family had gone to bed, Joseph sat alone by the dying fire, the photograph in his lap. His thoughts drifted to Ruth, to the farm they had built together, to the life they had shared. He felt a pang of loss, but it was softened now by acceptance and by the new life he had found here with Martha and her family. "I think you would approve, Ruth," he said softly to the empty room. "It's not what we planned, but it's good. It's enough." Spring arrived with its usual explosion of life. Crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow, birds returning from their winter journeys, newborn calves and lambs finding their feet in the greening pastures. Joseph, who had weathered the winter with only minor bouts of illness, felt his own renewal as the days lengthened and warmed. On a particularly fine April morning, Joseph and Solomon took their usual walk, venturing farther than they had in some time. They followed the lane to its end, then turned onto a little-used path that led up a gentle hill overlooking the farm. At the top, Joseph paused to catch his breath, leaning slightly against Solomon's solid presence. Below them stretched Martha's farm, the house with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn and stables, the fields showing the first tender green of new crops. Beyond that lay the neighboring farms, and in the far distance the small town where Joseph had once sold his harvest and bought his supplies. It was a different view than the one he'd had from his own farm, but no less beautiful. Different, but still part of the same world, the same cycle of seasons and growth and life that had always governed his days. Solomon nickered softly, nudging Joseph's shoulder with his nose. Joseph smiled, reaching up to stroke the horse's neck. "Yes, I see it too," he said. "It's going to be a good year." They stood together for a long time, man and horse, survivors of a journey that had nearly claimed them both. The bond forged in those desperate days on the road had evolved but never weakened. If anything, it had deepened with time and healing, becoming something rare and precious, a friendship that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. As the sun climbed higher, Joseph finally turned from the view. "Let's head back," he said to Solomon. "Martha will be wondering where we've got to." Solomon lowered his head slightly, allowing Joseph to grasp his mane for support as they began the descent. They moved slowly, carefully, each mindful of the other's pace and needs. Two old friends, walking together on a spring morning, heading home. Behind them, the sun illuminated the path they had traveled, casting their shadows long before them, no longer separate shapes but merged into one, moving forward together into whatever lay ahead.